Thanks for the chance to share with you some ideas on this topic today. Why is our country in deep trouble and what can we do about it? In what I will share next, I will draw heavily on a lecture that I gave late last year in 2020, focusing on inequality, dynasty, and oligarchy. So in a nutshell, I wanted to share some thoughts on the nature of inequality in our country. So in a word, my answer to that question of why we are in such deep trouble right now has to do with the different forms of inequality that are affecting our politics, our economics, and our society. So this is just a well-known figure on the inequality in opportunity, inequality in incomes, and the weak upward mobility that we have, that we seem to have as a country, combined with the vulnerability to shocks of some of our population. So here's the income pyramid for the Philippines. The poor households comprise 4.2 million. The low income households around 7.1 million. The middle income class households about 9.8. And finally, on top is about 320,000 households. So these are estimates based on the official statistics of government. And what they basically show us is a really imbalanced income distribution for the country. And it reflects the high Gini coefficient, the indicator of inequality, income inequality in the Philippines. And the headline here is, as of 2012, over 11.3 million Filipino households, around half of total, are classified as low income class or poor. And these households, including many in the middle income class, are actually quite vulnerable to shocks. So they can get knocked down from time to time. And I think the general observation with many studies is that there is weak upward mobility within the Philippines. So we are reducing poverty very, very slowly. We are emancipating some of our fellow Filipinos from poverty and destitution. But there is a very, very big group of Filipinos stuck in the base of the pyramid. Even as they are not poor, their aspirations for upward mobility are still not met by our society and economy. And the best way for many of them to meet those aspirations is actually to migrate or to work abroad. So this is the imbalance in opportunity that characterizes the high degree of inequality that we face in our economy. The second point I wanted to make is the inequality in politics. So that is best reflected in the concentration of political power that we see in the political dynasties. So this political inequality is something I've been doing research on for the past decade. And it seems that this inequality in power is very much linked to the inequality in wealth, which we just saw. Except it's pretty much characterized by this figure where while the leaders are in power, they can actually increase their wealth dramatically. So it's not necessarily clear whether they are pushing the common good while they are in power, or is it more of a personal family gain that seems to be the overriding concern for some of these leaders. And I'll just give you an example here. Thought-provoking example, I hope, is these two senators, one served from 2009 to 2012, increased her net wealth from 0.95, sorry, his net wealth from 0.95 to 1.45 billion. And then another senator that served in 2013 to 2019 increased net wealth from 1.63 to 3.53 billion. And I guess the punchline I just wanted to share here is not just that these are dramatic increases in net wealth while you are in power, while you are a senator. The other punchline is that these two senators are actually husband and wife. They're married to each other and actually belong to one of the most powerful political clans in the country. So again, this sort of signals and in fact mirrors the inequality in the economy, and a big group of Filipinos um, whose aspirations are not necessarily met by the economy, and a big inequality in the political system, where those pretty much those same Filipinos' voice is not as strong because the concentration of political power is in favor of political dynasties. So I believe the economic inequality and the political inequality are very much tied to each other, favoring a wealthy political class, and not in favor of you know the vast majority of our poor and low income Filipinos. The third point I wanted to make is a third type of inequality, a third story in terms of Philippine inequality, and that is that even the non-political entrepreneur class in the Philippines, the those engaged in business, the wealthiest of them are actually investing and conducting most of their business in areas that tend to be rent rich and are not necessarily known for dramatic job creation prospects. So the structure of the economy itself, in terms of where the wealthy and the big corporations are investing, does not seem to be conducive to the meeting of the aspirations of many Filipinos who aspire for more and better jobs. So this is just a figure that we've been collecting in terms of the 10 richest Filipinos. So that the top 10 billionaires in the Philippines. So that's the columns that you will see here in this figure, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 until 10. And the dots are where these wealthy Filipinos are actually conducting business or engaged in business. And the red area is actually that those sectors in the literature identified as very rent rich, rent being those types of activities that don't necessarily grow the economy but are very much engaged in redistributing wealth. And rent seeking is seen in the economics literature as one of those activities that don't necessarily improve competitiveness nor increase growth necessarily, and they are actually in many ways counterproductive and prone to corruption. The areas which tend to be more competitive, where innovation is more likely, where competition is healthier, these are areas where some of the wealthy invest. But clearly, if you will look at this graph, the concentration of activities are in banking and casinos, and in power and real estate. And these are areas that are not necessarily known for job creation, and pretty much describes the inability of our largest firms and wealthiest to break into export markets, improve our manufacturing, and create what many expected and argued as the third leg needed for our economy to grow and to produce inclusive growth. The first two legs being remittances and domestic services. So here's my full answer to that question of what ails us, and I just gave you a discussion of the three main inequalities that I feel, that I sense is part of the full answer, and it will be reflected in this framework that I will propose. So first of all, elections are dominated by political dynasties and there are weak political parties. We see that right now. Um, they don't necessarily lead to strong reform agendas. In fact, they tend to weaken and make more uncertain the reform agenda. This leads to, or at least opens the door for continuous state capture and rent seeking, to the extent that there is no strong institutional pushback against those types of behaviors. Then you have a healthy degree of corruption finance. Thanks to the rent-seeking behavior, there are many corrupt politicians who are able to amass war chests, which they can then um, use to further their personality type politics, their traditional politics, and also continue to engage in the political system in a very dominant way. And finally, all of this leads to an environment of weaker governance, weaker institutions, more uncertain reform agendas, and definitely they ultimately link up to a slower poverty reduction environment and the continued vulnerability of the middle class, the newly emancipated poor, who are not necessarily going to be benefiting from strong upward mobility. They get stuck in that base of the pyramid because it's still a highly unequal society. And if you have that as the basis for conducting elections, many uncertain, weak, and dependent um, voters who are vulnerable to intimidation, vulnerable to vote buying, and may not necessarily see themselves, their agency strengthened, then you have the conditions for the continued dominance of political clans, which then brings us back to this part. So here are the three main types of inequality that I just shared earlier, and they are seemingly linked into this narrative, circular narrative that reinforces each other. So political concentration of power leads to economic concentration because it doesn't really change the status quo. In fact, the politicians tend to benefit from the status quo. That economic concentration then leads to an inequality in opportunities and a vulnerability to getting knocked down the income ladder again and again, and that therefore characterizes the weak upward mobility in the country, which then again feeds into uh, the concentration of political power because the political class will just take advantage of that. So that, in a nutshell, is my interpretation of what ails us. Now, to add an additional idea, which is what might we be able to do in order to address this. Um, a simple framework which I and my colleagues in Ateneo Policy Center have been thinking about is comprised of building a more inclusive society, building a more inclusive democracy, and building a more inclusive economy. So inclusion is the way to break free from the inequality trap. What specifically does this entail? Well, several key elements include stronger social protection, for instance, during crises and shocks. So you don't get knocked down. If you got out of poverty, the chances of you being non-poor and continuing your way upwards should be strong. Uh, Building the prospects for strong upward social mobility, which can only occur in a society that builds more opportunities at home rather than abroad, or relying on opportunities abroad. An inclusive democracy must include a regulation of dynasties, just as we have the regulation of competition on the economic side. We need to begin to regulate the competition on the political side to ensure that our elections are still a healthy competition and the political system is not dominated by just a few political clans. Strengthening political parties will also help because that's where the alternative leaders may be coming from. And the final thought is in terms of the inclusive economy, and this is rather well known, improve the competition in the economy, such as opening up certain sectors that have been heavily regulated and protected, as well as strengthening innovations like the political competition, Philippines Competition Authority, which is a good innovation and a reform that is worth supporting moving forward. And then, of course, efforts to level the playing field in the economic space by eroding economic concentration and improving the prospects for new players who will bring in innovation and stronger competition in the Philippine landscape. Thank you for the chance to share these ideas, and I look forward to our discussion.
Alamin kung ano ang mga kasalukuyang ginagawa ng Participate. Bumisita lamang sa inclusivedemocracy.ph at i-follow ang aming social media accounts.